Good evening, friends. Welcome. My name is Rai Sigelko, and I am the director of the Leadership Center for Social Justice at United Theological Seminary of the Twin Cities. I want to welcome you all, to those of you on Zoom and those of you here in the auditorium at St. Thomas, to this very special documentary viewing and panel event in celebration of the release of the new film from Maestra Productions called Accompanying, The Journey of Staughton and Alice Lynd. This event concludes our series of events on the theme of accompaniment, which the Leadership Center for Social Justice has presented in memory of Staughton Lynd, who passed away on November 17th, 2020. I am very glad, quite honored actually, to be joined this evening for what will certainly be a rich conversation with a truly remarkable panel of guests, including Alice Lynd herself, one of the stars of the film we will be previewing tonight, and the excellent documentarian Catherine Murphy. In addition, we are joined by two dear friends of Staughton and Alice, Dr. Gwendolyn Zahara Simmons and Dr. Marcus Rediger. I will introduce our esteemed guests more fully in a moment. But before I do so, I want to express my gratitude to the Justice and Peace Studies program here at the University of St. Thomas, especially Dr. Mike Klein and Dr. Amy Finnegan. And to Rick Hendrickson, who is supporting us in IT this evening, and also to our friends at the East Side Freedom Library for co-sponsoring this evening's event. I also want to express my gratitude to the students present tonight who are currently enrolled in a Justice and Peace Studies class called Active Nonviolence. I myself took this class nearly 20 years ago here at St. Thomas, where I was first introduced to the historian Howard Zinn and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, commonly known as SNCC. I was introduced by both Zinn and SNCC by my teachers, Jack Nelson Pallmeyer and Marv Davidoff. I have many, many memories from that life-changing class, but one in particular has remained with me. Marv's oral histories is what he called them, in which he recounted just about every detail of his experience in a Mississippi State penitentiary known as Parchman Farm. You see, in 1961, Marv, a young white Jewish man and a student at neighboring Macalester College here in St. Paul, had decided to join the struggle for racial justice by answering a call to become a freedom rider. Organized by the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, and SNCC, the Freedom Riders actively challenged the status quo by riding interstate buses in the South in mixed racial groups. It was a remarkable example of what is called direct action. It was an action that directly disrupted the Jim Crow laws and customs that enforced segregation throughout the southern United States. Along with hundreds of other freedom riders from around the country, Marv was arrested and ended up at Parchman Farm, where he and others were badly, terribly abused by prison guards. But he would often say to us students, "You can jail the resistors, but you cannot jail the resistance." I would really only later come to learn and understand that Marv, my teacher, had participated in what many regard as a pivotal turning point in the movement for civil rights in this country. Indeed, Marv had been involved in something that changed the course not only of this country, but of the entire world. Now, I mentioned Marv this evening in part because I recently found out when I met Alice Lynd just last year that Alice once visited him in prison. And I mentioned Marv in part because both Staughton and Zahara joined SNCC in Mississippi not long after Marv was in prison at Parchment Farm. But most of all, I mention Marv here because I would not be standing here today if it weren't for his powerful witness and the fact that he shared his story in that class. Hearing his story as a 22-year-old changed the course of my life. Indeed, sharing the stories of the movement for social justice matters. I believe there is a common spirit of struggle that really does connect us together across time and space. But it's very important to share stories of the movement with one another so that that spirit lives on. This is something that I've learned from the great Vincent Harding, another dear friend of the people on this panel. He always emphasized this point, the need to share the story. This helps to strengthen us as human beings in the work for justice. But it also helps us to learn and grow because there's tremendous knowledge that is gained in the work of struggle for social justice. And perhaps it is more important than ever today to continue that storytelling work. Before I introduce our panelists, I want to say a few words about this word accompanying, which is the title of the documentary and also a key word in the life of Staughton and Alice Lynd. I'm sure others will talk about this as well throughout the night. As the documentary indicates, it was not until the 1980s, during their trips to Nicaragua, that Staughton and Alice found a word to describe what they had been doing most of their adult lives. They called it accompanying. It envisions people walking side by side and learning from each other. The idea is often associated with Oscar Romero, the Archbishop of San Salvador, who was assassinated while celebrating Mass on March 24th, 1980. In his final pastoral letters, Romero spoke of the kingdom of heaven as not only a future reality, but as something that is available to us here and now, present to those of us with eyes to see and ears to hear. Now, he saw this presence of the kingdom of heaven not in the established order of things. He was, after all, living under a repressive, fascist military regime. Instead, he saw the kingdom of heaven in the life of the ordinary people of San Salvador, the majority of whom lived in extreme poverty, but who nonetheless had begun to live together in such a way that they felt themselves to be brothers and sisters. And Romero recognized that it was the poor to whom Jesus turned. He united himself with, defended, and encouraged all those who in his day were on the margins of society: sinners, publicans, prostitutes, Samaritans, and lepers. For Romero, the kingdom of heaven then emerged in history not from above, in the halls of power, whether political or ecclesiastical, but from below, among the poor and the dispossessed. And Romero believed that his ministerial task was to accompany those in the struggle for life and together oppose the structural forces of death for the sake of that new world. Now, Staughton wrote a little book in 2012 called Accompanying: Pathways to Social Change, which reflects on this theme of accompaniment and reflects on the social movements of the 20th century in which he played a pivotal part, and Alice too. The book has a simple but provocative thesis. He writes, quote, that most, not all, of the movements of the 1960s suffered from a mistaken and superficial conception of social change that we called organizing. Staughton challenges a model of organizing that is still quite dominant today, which views organizing as a process whereby person A, this is from his book, decides what would be desirable for person B to think and do, and then seeks to bring about that predetermined result. You see, Staughton believed that this model of organizing was mistaken and superficial because it has often, from his perspective, resulted in a restrictive institutional environment that can come to obstruct or undermine creative and spontaneous action from below. As an alternative, Staughton suggested a different practice and a different vision to those of us who are seeking to transform our world. He calls this practice and this vision accompaniment. Tonight, we're going to have the opportunity to preview a number of segments from this wonderful documentary that charts the story of Staughton and Alice Lynd's life together. It is a story of accompanying. We'll hear memories and stories from some of the most significant movements for social justice of the last century. We will do this through dialogue and conversation, reflecting together, learning alongside one another what it might mean for us today to continue to struggle for a more just world. Our sharing and dialogue as a panel will take place between our viewing of various segments of the film. We'll watch a segment and then have dialogue, and then we'll watch another segment and have more dialogue. I invite you to watch the film in its entirety on your own later, and we'll send a link out to viewers. We will not this evening have a separate time for Q&A. Instead, I invite you, those of you online, to put your questions in the chat as they arise, and I will try to incorporate them as questions into our conversation throughout the evening. Now, allow me to introduce our panelists. First of all, our special guest is, of course, Alice Lynd herself. Married to Staughton for many, many decades. I don't know the exact number, maybe she can share. She is a Quaker and was a draft counselor and trainer of draft counselors during the Vietnam War. In 1968, Alice published We Won't Go, Personal Accounts of War Objectors. She later became first a paralegal and then a lawyer. After retirement from practicing labor law in the wake of plant shutdowns, she became an advocate for prisoners sentenced to death and/or held for years in solitary confinement at Ohio's supermaximum security prison. Alice continues to do this good work. Welcome, Alice. Next, Dr. Gwendolyn Zahara Simmons is a human rights activist, a scholar of women in Islam, and faculty member in the Department of Religion at the University of Florida, Gainesville. A former leader of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in Laurel, Mississippi, and Atlanta, Georgia, Simmons helped found independent Black political organizations in the 1970s. She is also a Sufi Muslim who draws on the compassion and inclusiveness of her faith in her work. In 2016, at the invitation of the Fellowship of Reconciliation, she lectured in 4 European countries about the history and meaning of the African American freedom movement. Welcome, Zahara. Dr. Marcus Rediger is the Distinguished Professor of Atlantic History at the University of Pittsburgh. His Histories from Below, including The Slave Ship, A Human History, have won numerous awards, including the George Washington Book Prize, and he has been translated into 17 languages worldwide. He produced a film, Ghosts of Amistad, with director Tony Buba, and wrote a play, The Return of Benjamin Lay, with playwright Naomi Wallace. Welcome, Marcus. And finally, Catherine Murphy, an independent producer. Catherine focuses primarily on social documentaries. She has field-produced films like Saul Landau's Will the Real Terrorists Please Stand Up? And Eugene Core's From Ghost Town to Havana. Catherine also served on Gay Cuba's production crew and subtitled Stealing America by Dorothy Fadiman, Jamie Kibben's The Greening of Cuba, and Out and Refuseniks by Sonia DeVries. While in Caracas in 2009, Catherine founded Tres Musas Producciones, a collaborative production house of independent women producers working in film, music, and literature. Eduardo Galeano published 4 short stories based on her interviews in his most penultimate book, Espejos. Let's welcome our guests. I want to turn it now over to Catherine to share with us a bit about the film and the process of making this film that we'll be viewing tonight. Catherine.
Thank you so much. Thank you for creating the space for us all to dialogue about Accompanying. I'm really honored and delighted to be launching the Accompanying film with you all this evening. It has been a labor of love. It's been a journey of learning, and the journey continues. It's also been a collective process. I think all of our work is collective, right? And this documentary journey most certainly was collective. It was created by a collective that ebbed and flowed over a period of at least 5 years, probably more. At the core is the organization that I work with, Maestra Productions, and also Prison Radio, the team at Prison Radio, Noelle Hanrahan, Jennifer Beach, and an incredible group of student interns that they mobilized that worked with us for about a year on this project. Was sort of the first phase. We've had a wonderful editor, Emmett Williams, but we've also had several editors helping, and a number of people, many, Marta, Lynd Atlan, Ben Morgan, and quite an amazing collective team, again, that's ebbed and flowed, but we've all contributed insights, interpretations. We've found material. A lot of the footage that you'll see was created by other filmmakers, journalists, activists, oral historians over the many, many decades of Staughton and Alice's amazing life. And they were very generous with us sharing their materials. But I also, came to see that this was a journey of accompanying itself in the journey. Like, we work together as a collective, but we work very, very, very closely with Staughton and Alice. And I would say led by Staughton and Alice in some core way, right? It didn't necessarily start out that way, but it evolved that direction. And I think that was part of this path of accompanying. And so sort of building the documentary and learning about accompanying went together. And, from this perspective of social justice filmmaking and using the medium, the audiovisual medium, as a vehicle for consciousness raising, as a vehicle for the reciprocal kind of learning that we do, as a vehicle for movement history, for oral history, and for liberation, honoring our liberation history, but hopefully contributing to moving it forward. That really is the spirit that went into making this film. So one of the things that we really heard from Alice and Staughton over and over was carry it on. That, like, seeing themselves in this long journey of peace and justice, folks, but that it's a continuing history and we need to continue it. And I really hope that this film will contribute to that. One of the first interviews that we did, aside from the found footage, was with Dr. Zohara Simmons 10 years ago. I was realizing today, preparing for this evening, 10 years ago, at the 50-year anniversary of Freedom Summer. And it started, this really, from our corner, it started as a project on freedom schools. We were exploring the SNCC and core freedom schools in a film that is yet unfinished and that will hopefully be finished before too long. But through our friends at Teaching for Change, we got in touch with Staughton and called Staughton to ask if he would do an interview about the Mississippi Freedom Schools of 1964 and beyond and their legacy for today. And he said, yes, we have a freedom school. We work with a freedom school now that is this living legacy of liberation education. We work with a group of incarcerated men in the Ohio Correctional Institution down the road from our house. And every Friday we teach a class that started as the history of nonviolence in America, but also evolved as the incarcerated people, students, chose, wanted, desired, and they started to request and recommend. And the whole project shifted. And when I first visited, it was called the Listening Project. So in honor of listening, and listening being such a big part of accompaniment, of what I've come to understand as accompaniment, and what I also see as part of social justice filmmaking, I leave you with the film. I hope that you enjoy it. I'm so honored to be part of this dialogue tonight, this evening. And again, the link to the film goes open and free for you all starting this evening, and hope that that this is just the beginning of the road of the film, and that you all will use it in your own movements, organizations, classrooms, etc. So carry it on.
Thank you, Catherine.
Thank you.
Oh, well, I'm preaching and teaching with my mind. My mind is what's on freedom. Preaching and teaching with my mind. It was there on freedom. Hallelujah. Hallelujah. Hallelujah.
In the spring of 1964, a coalition of civil rights organizations, including the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, launched a volunteer campaign to register as many Black voters in Mississippi as possible. They also sought to establish freedom schools, an alternative to Mississippi's racially segregated and economically unjust school system. Staughton was recruited by SNCC to head the summer education program in Mississippi that focused on Black history and constitutional rights.
Bob Moses was generally understood to be the person with the most natural authority in the summer project. He approached the need for a strategy in Mississippi by visiting a number of local activists and listening to their descriptions of what they thought they most needed. He had great respect for the opinions of ordinary people, and if possible, would walk beside them in leading by example. He resisted coming to the front of a room when he was asked to offer an opinion. If he did address a gathering, he would ask questions.
Staughton met SNCC staff member John O'Neill on an Atlanta picket line. The Lynds invited him to stay at their apartment while John awaited his first SNCC assignment. A year later, in November 1963, John O'Neill and SNCC asked Staughton to serve as the coordinator of the Mississippi Freedom Schools.
Here is John O'Neill on the phone. Staughton, we're going to have this Freedom Summer next year. We're going to have something called Freedom Schools. Would you like to be the coordinator? I did have the the insight, the perspicacity to see that, wait just a minute, a white administrator for a summer program, freedom program for Black teenagers, that's a little odd. And there was a Black graduate student at Morehouse who I played tennis with, and I said, Harold.
Well, and wasn't he someone who had been a sit-inner in Orangeburg?
In jail, and
I
I said,
already had a reputation as a civil rights activist.
Harold, how'd you like to be co-director of the Mississippi Freedom School? He said, I'd go to Mississippi and check it out. Took a bus to Mississippi, came back. He said, you're all out of your minds. People are going to be killed there.
I was taking a class with Dr. Staughton Lynd, who was one of the Freedom School directors. And one of the projects I got involved with for grade was to work on the development of the curriculum for the Freedom Schools. We were going to go into Mississippi and do 2 or 3 things. One was certainly to work on remedial English, remedial math. The other thing was to teach African-American history and culture from a positive point of view. And thirdly, to explain to young people why we needed a civil rights movement.
Without attempting to describe the whole Freedom School experience, it was probably the single best thing in terms of activity, job, whatever that I've done in my life. Because I run around talking about a different kind of future. Well, this was a different kind of future. And from an educational point of view, I was the right person for the job. Not because I was white, not because I was a Yale professor, but because temperamentally I was kind of anarchist. You know, I thought things had to come up out of the ground rather than being planted there. And what I said to the Freedom School teachers at our orientation was,
Was this 1963? 64
June 64.
in Mississippi.
In well, no, in southwestern Ohio was where the orientation was.
Okay.
I said, here's the curriculum. There was a conference in New York. People took on various assignments. About half of them were completed in some fashion. Alice endlessly turned the handle of a duplicating machine, something like a mimeograph, but not actually a mimeograph. And I said, here's the curriculum. Best minds in the movement that contributed to it. But my suggestion to you is you feel your way with the kids. And when you run out of ideas, take a look at the curriculum and see if, well, it just had to be that way because places were getting burned. People were being arrested. 3 people had been killed. It was in many ways a continuation of my teaching at Staughton. I wasn't weighed down by academic considerations. Should I make this into an article for a prestigious journal? No, I was living the dream. Twice as many kids as they had planned for, twice as many schools as they had expected. I mean, these were families, at least in northwestern Mississippi and the so-called delta of the river, where the cotton production was concentrated. These were families where the kids mostly helped their parents in the fields during the summer. And family after family said, no, I want Sammy or Susie to have this experience.
I've yet to run into anyone who has a bad word to say about the Mississippi Freedom Schools. I wound up being the white coordinator of this improvised school system for Black youngsters, in which most of the teachers as well were white. But somehow that white and Black thing in the Freedom Schools worked. And it's a cherished memory, I think, for almost every human being that it touched.
At the start of the week-long orientation for Freedom School volunteers, word traveled that 3 civil rights workers had been arrested and released at midnight, and they were now missing. Andrew Goodman, James Chaney, and Mickey Schwerner had been traveling to investigate the burning of the Mount Zion Church in Philadelphia, Mississippi, and they were looking for a new Freedom School location. They were never heard from again.
I remember the dread among the volunteers as we learned about the disappearance of the 3. Freedom School volunteers were phoning home to discuss the crisis with their families. Later that day, Bob Moses spoke to the volunteers. I will never forget Bob as he spoke, very slowly, very softly, so that the entire crowded room fell silent, straining to hear. Bob said we had to assume the 3 missing men were dead. Bob said he could not guarantee the safety of any volunteer who went on to Mississippi. He could only promise those who went to Mississippi that he would be going with them. All but 1 volunteer decided to go.
6 weeks later, the bodies of Schwerner, Goodman, and Chaney were discovered in an earthen dam. At almost the same time, Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, authorizing Lyndon Johnson to take action to protect American interests in Vietnam.
And the reason that Mickey Schwerner and Andrew Goodman and James Chaney went to Philadelphia that Sunday was to try to find another site for the Freedom School. So we had the memorial service at the site of the burned church, almost at the same time that the bodies of the 3 young men had been found. The Congress of the United States adopted the so-called Tonkin Bay Resolution, which gave President Johnson a free hand in escalating the Vietnam War.
The lesson of all these deaths is that men must stop killing, Bob said. There is a connection between these 2 events. Dark-skinned people are being killed in Mississippi and in Vietnam.
That even those most deeply involved in the civil rights movement in the South, even at such a moment of solemnity, when there would have been every incentive to talk about nothing but, our movement and our people, at that moment, they were thinking about the whole world. The whole world.
Well, I've asked Zahara Simmons to share with us some of her memories of that time. You got to see her there briefly. And so I would invite Zahara to share a bit about her experiences in those days and her relationship to Staughton and Alice.
Thank you so, so very much. I met Staughton and Alice as a freshman at Spelman College, and coming from Memphis, Tennessee, and spending all of my growing up in a, deeply segregated, deeply racist society, I had never had relationships with white people ever, other than, pretty much adversarial. And so to get to Spelman, which, was my dream come true, and to find that there were white teachers there. And as I can recall, I don't really know how I wound up in a history class. It was a joint history and English class, and it was an experimental class. As best I can recall, some of us were assigned to the class. And so there was Dr. Staughton Lynd and Miss Esther Seaton. And we were learning American history and learning American literature. And both of them focused very heavily on African American history and African American lit. And so I was learning things that I knew nothing about. I had never been taught in my school. And even though, our Black churches and all celebrated Black History Week and all of that, there were so many people that I learned about that I had never heard of. And it was really a turning point. I think the most important thing was to learn the history of Black struggle from the enslavement period forward. And of course, that had never been emphasized. And you got to recall that this is happening while the student movement is raging, and it was raging there in Atlanta. And so for the first time, I'm beginning to understand, thanks to Dr. Lynd and Esther Seaton, that this was a continuation of a long struggle. And that had never, the movement had not been presented to me in that way. And that it just had such a profound impact on me. And of course, Howard Zinn was also there. I arrived in the fall of '62, and Spelman was doing everything it could to keep us from becoming involved in the student movement that was going on. SNCC had its national headquarters about 3 blocks from the campus, and they were always on the campus recruiting us, telling us when the next demonstration was going to be held, the next sit-in, etc. And of course, because the school had warned us, those of us particularly on scholarship, and that's the only reason that I was there and the only way that I was there on full scholarship, that we would lose our scholarships. And so it was Staughton played such an important role, because in a very gentle way, he was encouraging me to get involved, he and Howard Zinn. And so his teaching and what he emphasized in the classroom connected with the fact that I had joined a church, as I had been told under no circumstances could I not do from my parents and grandmother, because church was such an important part of my growing up. And so, not even knowing who he was, I had joined the West Hunter Street Baptist Church, which was 3 blocks from the campus, and the minister there was Ralph David Abernathy, whom I had no idea who he was. But so between the West Hunter Street Baptist Church, Staughton Lynd's class, and Esther Seaton's class, and the SNCC students, I mean, the SNCC organizers being on campus constantly, berating us for not getting involved, they helped to break my fear and reticence down. And of course, over the 2 years that I was there at Spelman, I became very close friends with Alice and Staughton. And I learned about Mississippi Freedom Summer and learned that Dr. Lynd was working on the curriculum, and I got involved with that. And I knew I had to go to Mississippi and be a part of that nonviolent army of young people going into the state to break it open to the people in this country as to what was going on, the horrors that Black people were living under, the danger they lived under, and how they risked their lives even to register to vote. So moving along quickly, I had known that my grandmother, who raised me principally, had taught me all my life about the dangers of Mississippi. So I knew she would never approve of my going. So my intention was not to go home at the end of my sophomore semester and to just spend time there staying either with SNCC people until it was time to go to the orientation in Ohio. But my grandmother found out about it, and on the last day of school, she, my mother, and stepdad were there and dragged me home. And I was in touch with Staughton as well as Jim Foreman at the SNCC office saying, I don't have any money, but if somebody can get me a ticket on a Greyhound bus, I'm coming back. And of course, Staughton was very involved in getting that ticket to me. And when I left home, my grandmother, mother, and father were there, and they told me if I leave, never to come back. So I cried all the way on the Greyhound bus from Memphis to Atlanta. And when I got off the bus, there was Staughton and Alice, and they embraced me and told me that they were my family now. And so my love for them over all these decades has been so strong, and they played such an important role in my coming into the movement and supporting me in my decisions to become an activist.
Thank you, Zahara. I want to open it up to the panel. If you want to unmute Alice, Marcus, and Catherine to just have a conversation with Zahara about what she shared about that segment of the film. And also to those of you on Zoom, you may submit questions and I'll be checking those and I can bring those in. And if you have a question in the auditorium here, you can raise your hand and we'll try to get to that as well. Estella has a microphone, she can walk around. We're going to try to do a few things at once. But I'll just open it up to anybody for the panel would like to respond or to what Zahara said.
Yes, I would like for you to tell about your experience when you got to Mississippi.
Oh boy. Thank you, Alice. Well, as I mentioned, my grandmother, Rhoda Douglas, who had been a sharecropper and growing up in Arkansas and, living through some of the very difficult times that Black people lived through. But she thought Mississippi was the worst place for a Black person in the world. And she had told me all these horror stories. So while I knew I had to go, I was terrified. And when they made the assignments for us, and of course, let me just mention that because I went there with no money, SNCC put me on payroll from the time I got to Atlanta, and payroll meant $10 a week because I was penniless. So anyway, that meant that I stayed for the full 2 weeks of the orientation. And let me just say that I went in the car with Staughton. I was clear I was going to be a Freedom School teacher. And we drove from Atlanta to Ohio. And when they made my assignment, they told me I was going to Laurel, Mississippi. Well, I'd never heard of Laurel. I'd heard of Meridian, Greensboro, Jackson, you know, and I knew that's where SNCC had major projects. So of course, that's where I wanted to be. And when they told me I was going to Laurel, I said, well, Laurel, where is it? You know, and they also told me that there would be 2 other people assigned to Laurel, and that all the 3 of us were Black because it was too dangerous to send white people to Laurel, that it was headquarters of the Ku Klux Klan. Well, now I'm already terrified. So it's like, what? I mean, I had thought that maybe we might survive this ordeal because of the number of white people. But of course, the fact that Goodman and Schwerner had already disappeared before we even left, those of us who were there that second week, I had already begun to say, oh my God, you mean those Mississippi white people will kill these white students? That had been what I thought might, you know, keep me alive. And then I'm going to Laurel, where it's all too dangerous. But anyway, on we went, the 3 of us. And the other thing about Laurel was it had no infrastructure, it had no movement structure. And so we had to stay in Hattiesburg and drive back the 30 miles north to Laurel to see if we could find people that wanted the Freedom Summer Project in their city. And we had a list of names, and most of them were NAACP members. So on my list, I had this lady named Eberta Spinks, and I had the address. And so we drove there, and I went to the door to knock on the door. They thought, the 2 guys thought, well, you'll be less frightening if it's a woman going to the door, you know. So I knock on the door. Mrs. Spinks comes to the door, and I'm like just totally dumbfounded about, how do you ask somebody, can they let you live with them, knowing that it could mean that their house would be burned to the ground, they could be killed. So I'm sort of trying to stumble around, and she looks at me because I got on blue jeans, I have an afro, and she says, are you one of those freedom riders? And I didn't know if that was going to be good or bad to answer yes, but I said, yes, ma'am. And she said, girl, come on in. I've been waiting on you all my life. Now, she was in her 50s. And I said, really? She said, yes. So that was really the beginning of the Laurel Project. And because she was like, what do you need? And I said, well, there are 2 guys out there in the car. We need somewhere to stay. She said, well, you can stay here, and I'm going to ask my neighbor across the street, Miss Carrie Clayton, if she'll put the 2 guys up. Go out there and get those boys. So they came in, and that was the beginning of the project. This woman was like a miracle worker. And through her, we were connected with other people who were interested. And our first office was on the back porch of Carrie Clayton's house because nobody wanted to rent to us. And Mrs. Spinks helped open the churches up, her church in particular. And her pastor was terrified, and she said, I don't care. We're going to open up this church to these kids because we got to have a project here in Laurel, Mississippi. So that was the beginning. And while I had gone there to be the Freedom School director, one of the young men who was to be the project director was arrested soon after we got to Laurel because he had an outstanding warrant. And then I was told, you have to become the project director. And I'm like, I don't know anything about being a project director. I came here to do the school. That's what I'm geared to. And they said, doesn't matter. We don't have anybody to send. You're from the South. You've been to jail, because I had been to jail in Atlanta with the sit-ins, and you can do it temporarily. So that was like baptism by fire in Laurel, Mississippi.
Thanks so much for sharing that, Zahara. And I noticed a book behind you that I want you to maybe pull out and show us. But if you want to learn more about the story of Zahara Simmons and her life, there's this beautiful book that Dan Berger published called State on Freedom. And I really highly recommend it. It's very readable. It's a wonderful book, and it tells more of these stories. So thanks so much for sharing that with us. We're going to transition to the next segment of the film. I know we could continue to talk about the civil rights movement, but we have more to share. We're going to look at 3 different segments. This will be the a segment on Vietnam, draft counseling, and history from the bottom up.
In 1965, Staughton remained preoccupied with the debate about the civil rights movement. In February 1965, he was invited by SNCC in Selma, Alabama, to discuss the possibility of organizing a freedom school there, but that idea never got off the ground.
But on the plane back, here I am reading the newspaper, and it talks about the United States bombing North Vietnam for the first time in response to an incident at a town in South Vietnam named Pleiku. And somehow I just knew that, all right, this is going to be my life for the next several years. No one should be surprised that white radical academics emerging from the milieu of the Southern movement, like Howard Zinn and myself, and I'm sure there were others, were just from day one categorical, total, relentless, unforgiving opponents of everything that was being done in Vietnam.
Escalation of the war was proceeding very rapidly. Unless there was a movement calling national conferences and days of protests, opponents of the war might be preventing from exercising First Amendment rights in any way.
People on the New Left trace back not merely to the pacifist movement since World War I, but also, for example, to the abolitionists, to Thoreau's non-payment of taxes, to the civil disobedience of Northern abolitionists in harboring fugitive slaves and the like.
At editorial meetings of Liberation magazine in New York, Staughton forged alliances with pacifists A.J. Musty, nonviolent activist Dave Dellinger, and Barbara Deming. The first big demonstration against the Vietnam War was held on April 17, 1965, in Washington, D.C. It was organized by Students for a Democratic Society and chaired by Staughton.
And in the spring of 1965, I can remember writing letters on that hectograph, calling meetings to the effect that we have to do something over the summer. Because if we don't, by the time the students come back to campus in September, there will be an atmosphere that will make it very difficult.
I ain't gonna study, oh no more. Ain't gonna study, oh no more. Ain't gonna study, oh. no, no, I ain't gonna study, oh, no, ain't gonna study, no, no, ain't gonna study anymore, no more.
On August 6th to 9th, 1965, the 20th anniversary of the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, an assembly of unrepresented people was held on the Mall in Washington, at which anti-war activists sought to march to the steps of the U.S. Capitol to declare peace with the people of Vietnam. David Dellinger, Staughton Lynd, and Bob Moses led the way. Counter-protesters hurled red paint on the group. Dellinger, Lynd, Moses, and many others were arrested.
We planned to assemble on the steps of Congress and say that somebody else might be at war with the people of Vietnam, but we were not. I think 3 lines of District of Columbia policemen awaiting us. Bob Moses and I were immediately arrested. And as the paddy wagon pulled away, I saw what David had done. He invited the protesters not to try to make their way through the police line, but just to sit on the grass in a semicircle and to pass from hand to hand what was our manifesto of the moment, the document called the Declaration of Conscience with respect to the war in Vietnam, or something close to that. Each person would read a sentence and then pass it to the next person. And David had somehow managed to sit with his back to the policeman and sent them a silent message as his lack of respect for not for them, but for the position they were taking. And I was able in this assemblage of people who had come together to honor him before his death, I was able to say that I thought it was the most spectacular example of teaching that I thought I had ever encountered.
Staughton was much more involved than I. But we had friends like Todd and Nancy Gitlin who came to visit us. And I remember Nancy having been in touch with Vietnamese women. She may have made a trip to Vietnam, I'm not sure. But she talked about Vietnamese women who during the night would go out and talk to the soldiers and plead with them, not to damage their village or whatever it might be. And I had the feeling, what can I, as a mother of young children, do that could be comparable in some way to what those Vietnamese women were doing to try to reduce the effects of war? In the summer of 1965, August 6th to 9th, which was a commemoration of the atomic bombings at Nagasaki and Hiroshima, Staughton and other friends organized an assembly of unrepresented people with the purpose of declaring peace with the people of Vietnam. That is to say, our government may be fighting you, but we American citizens are not. This is not our war with you. The workshop the demonstration took place over several days on the mall in Washington, D.C. And a lot of different groups would set up a tent and have workshops, or even out on the grass have a workshop. And at that time, I was very concerned about the possibility that the House Un-American Activities Committee would go after Staughton, among others. And so I went to a workshop on that topic. And then when it was over, I was looking around for another workshop. And I saw a little tent that said Central Committee for Conscientious Objectors. So I went in. And they were talking about the need for draft counselors. So after the workshop ended, I went up to the man who was leading it and I said, can I be a draft counselor? Because I figured that would not involve anything outside the home necessarily. I mean, we lived 5 blocks from Yale University. People could come to us. I didn't have to be outside with a picket sign running the risk of being arrested, which I was not willing to do. So I said, could I be a draft counselor? And he thought about it. And he said, well, yes, there's one woman who does it. If you could get anybody to come to you. At the Yale Divinity School, were concerned that people who were serving as ministers or in divinity school were exempt from the draft at that time. And they felt, why should we be exempt and all these other people are being drafted? What should we do about it? So they wanted to come and discuss these things.
And there was a woman there who had a friend by the name of Tom Rod, who was in prison for non-cooperation. That is, for not registering, just saying no part of it for me. And she said she thought that Tom, now that he was in prison, regretted his stand. Well, Staughton and I also knew Tom, and I thought, I wonder if that's really what Tom would say. So at the end of the meeting, I said to Staughton, you know what your next book should be? You should get interviews or writings from different people that we know who have taken various stands as conscientious objectors or non-cooperators or whatever it is, and find out what they would say if they were here in our living room to these students who are grappling with these issues. If they've tried it already, how do they feel? What did they try and how did they feel about what they did? So Staughton turns to me and says, why me? I thought, I can't do it. Well, I'll help you.
I published We Won't Go in the fall of '68. It was the first written work that I had ever done. Put together a book of personal accounts of war objectors with a whole wide range of grounds and of what they did.
My conscience won't let me go shoot my brother or some darker people or some poor, hungry people in the mud for big, powerful America and shoot them for what? They never called me nigger. They never lynched me.
One of the most significant contributions to the book was by David Mitchell. He argued that the U.S. government's actions in Vietnam violated the Nuremberg Principles. This approach was broad and would allow any soldier, not just those with religious objections, to challenge war crimes.
I refused to cooperate with the draft because it was being used to implement illegal and immoral policies and actions in Vietnam. I was a member of an In the Draft group opposed to the war and the draft. The group's statement read in part, in the tradition of Thoreau and the principles of individual guilt and individual responsibility established in the Nuremberg trials and in the first session of the United Nations, we assert the right and the obligation of the individual to protest and to disassociate himself from these criminal preparations.
The Lynd's youngest child, Martha, was born in February 1967, and that summer the family moved to Chicago.
When the Central Committee for Conscientious Objectors set up their Midwest office in Chicago, I was hired as one of their staff people to train draft counselors.
After a year, Alice moved to the Chicago regional office of the American Friends Service Committee.
You know, the person comes in and you have to try to find out, well, what is this person trying to resolve? What are the pressures on him? What is it that he feels about his life that he has to be able to act now in a way that he's going to be glad at the age of 50 that that's the choice that he made? And it's very hard for these young men, I mean, 17, 18, 19, 20 years old, and to explore that with them. What channels are thinkable and which ones aren't? And, you know, what they're coming to a V in the road. They take one of those paths, they're excluding the other path. And there may be a number of forks in the road. But those things that they're choosing are also choosing not. And how are they going to resolve those things? And it takes a lot of exploration and not pushing. Before a man refused induction, I would interview that person and make sure that everything that could have been done administratively had been done before referral to an attorney. And then I would get feedback from these guys who would go to an attorney and complain to me, the attorney wants to try out this theory. If I go to prison, I don't want to go for his reasons. I want to go for my reasons.
Questions that you ask when you're a draft counselor have to do with the whole meaning of life for such people. You know, what their spiritual grounding is, what they can imagine themselves doing, how they're going to relate to their families, how they're going to relate to their future ideals of vocation, how they're going to respect themselves when they're 50 years old. But you don't tell them what to do.
In the second half of the 20th century, a few historians began to challenge the approach to history from the viewpoint of the wealthy elite and U.S. government imperialism. These pioneers began writing history from the bottom up, giving a strong voice to working people. It was history that understood resistance movements and a history that recognized those who advocated nonviolence as being a viable alternative to murder and war. Having begun to do oral history in compiling We Won't Go, the Lynds next embarked on personal histories of rank-and-file labor activists entitled Rank and File. Some of the accounts in that book were recorded at a writer's workshop in Gary, Indiana.
It was a sense of wanting to pass on to younger people what the people working in the mills and the auto factories and so forth had gone through in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s, and pass on their experiences, their knowledge to a younger generation. Some of these people were very courageous, and also that they were grappling with issues that are just going to come up over and over and over and over again, generation by generation. And that in seeking for answers, that they might be able to find something in the past that would be meaningful to them.
Some of the accounts were drawn from a forum on labor history from the viewpoint of the rank and file, held on 3 evenings in 1970 in East Chicago, Indiana. The first session was devoted to the starting of the CIO. During the second session on the growth of a rank and file opposition, John Sargent, who had served repeatedly as local president of the Steelworkers Union at Inland Steel, was one of the speakers.
For decades afterwards, Staughton would quote John Sargent speaking about the end of the Little Steel strike at Inland Steel in 1937.
Without a contract, without any agreement with the company, without any regulations concerning hours of work, conditions of work or wages, a tremendous surge took place. Without a contract, we secured for ourselves agreements on working conditions and wages that we do not have today. As a result of the enthusiasm of the people in the mill, you had a series of strikes, wildcats, shutdowns, slowdowns, anything working people could think of to secure for themselves what they decided they had to have.
The Nation magazine embraced the collection, calling Rank and File one of the best works of oral history produced by radical historians.
All right. Well, I've invited Marcus Rediger and Alice to have a dialogue about these segments of the film, specifically on the Vietnam War and draft counseling, but also this idea of history from below or history from the bottom up. So I'll hand it over to the both of you.
Alice, we can't hear you. You have to unmute.
I feel that Marcus has done a great deal more than I with regard to history from the bottom up.
Well, Alice, I'm happy to get things started. We should all remember that Staughton was a historian, that history meant a great deal to him. And also, as has already been noted, this idea of carrying on a tradition of resistance. And we've already witnessed the power of this history from the bottom up when Zahara said quite beautifully that what really made a tremendous impact on her was learning that this struggle had gone on for a long time before she joined it. So this idea of studying people's history, as Howard Zinn liked to call it, history from below, as Edward Thompson and other New Left historians called it, history from the bottom up, as Staughton called it. This was really movement history. This was a way of not only teaching the past, but encouraging people to understand that ordinary folks just like them had already made a lot of history. That in fact, the things that we have, the democratic rights, any aspect of equality, that's because previous generations fought for that and won it. And so Alice, a question to you. The great Caribbean scholar activist C.L.R. James liked to say, people learn history as they're making history. Mm-hmm. And since you and Staughton made so much history, I hope you'll say a little bit more about how learning history assisted you in the work that you did. Staughton has talked about this, for example, in terms of studying the Black freedom struggle. But I'm very interested in what kind of history to resistance you knew when you were helping people decide if they wanted to resist the war in Vietnam.
Well, I think there, with regard to draft counseling, these were people who came from families who might not support them in their resistance. So what was it in their lives that made them want to take this very controversial and consequential stand that they did? How far were they willing to go? Some of these people were in the military when they realized they were being asked to do things they just could not do. And I think that that's happened a great deal in the years since the Vietnam War, resulting in what we documented in our book on moral injury, that when people are asked to do things that they feel are just fundamentally wrong and shakes up their whole orientation, how can people do things like that? You know, how can there be a God in heaven, or how can I believe in my religious upbringing if this is what's going to happen? I mean, it just shakes people to the roots of their being and becomes, in some instances, quite crippling, or, just extreme behavior in reaction to it, of taking risks of their lives or suffering because they are unwilling to do these things that war demands of them.
Mhm.
I
You
think
know, Alice,
also with regard to this business of what can you bring by way of perspective, my experience in the last more than 25 years has been working with prisoners. Well, I know the history where the various attorneys or direct people in the positions of responsibility have rotated. So they don't know the history that I know continuously. So they'll make some decision that's contrary to a court order, and I have the court order. And I can, because of having been in it so long, produce something that has been litigated and to say, this is a no-no.
Mhm. Yeah, you know, Alice, one of the things that I think history from the bottom up offers to anyone involved in any movement anywhere, it says you are not alone. A lot of people have been fighting for these things for a long time. You are not all by yourself. And I do think it's important, Alice, that you, especially as a Quaker, when it came to nonviolent resistance in the era of the Vietnam War, you had 300 years of Quaker pacifism behind you. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the Quaker roots of a lot of the movements that you and Staughton were involved in.
Well, at one point when I was in a crisis situation where I anticipated really getting in a jam with the law because of being asked to do something. I was asked to testify against a man who had committed murder, but he had explained this to me in an attorney-client interview. And the attorney-client privilege belongs to the client, not to the attorney. So I've turned to reading about Margaret Fell, who centuries ago, when the Quakers were really getting started, she would go when somebody was going to be executed, going to be hung, and she would go and stand right by that person until he was gone. Quakers were imprisoned because they wouldn't take off their hats to the king or show this kind of reverence for authority. They felt that, if there's a kind of egalitarian, yes, an equal thing, so that Quakers traditionally had experience in prisons. And unfortunately, it was from the Quakers that the idea was if you keep people in solitary confinement, they'll mend their ways. Well, it drives them crazy instead. That has very serious physical as well as psychological effects. And I've been tackling that one for several decades. But I do think that sense of speaking truth to power is was originally a Quaker phrase. And I think that sense that if you see something wrong, it doesn't mean you just say, well, that's how it is. There's nothing you can do about it. You see if there is some way that you can relieve human suffering.
No, I think the one of the important parts of history from below is to treat ordinary working people as thinkers, as you and Staughton have always done, that they're not passive recipients of ideas, that they have their own experiences and that they make their own decisions, which are frequently principled decisions. But it's not always easy to see that because we're talking about working people who don't produce historical sources, whose voices are marginalized. I mean, this is certainly true in the history of the study of slavery, to try to recover the voices of the enslaved as they engaged in those struggles of self-emancipation. But I've just always been very impressed by the way in which you and Staughton both made history and made the teaching of history part of the struggle that you engaged in. And that, of course, is a great way to carry it on.
Well, I think Catherine, who has studied Pablo Freire, I mean, Freire is an exemplar of this approach of starting with people's own living experience, the things that they know that they can bring to it, and how to open up more possibilities to them. And I hope at some point in this program, Catherine will be speaking to that. Maybe this is the moment.
Sure, this is a great moment. Thank you. I think, right, it's like these various roads to come to building a more just, democratic, participatory, loving society and world are so interwoven. And the work with Paulo Freire, working with the team to look at the early work that Paulo Freire was doing in the years leading up to writing Pedagogy of the Oppressed, because so much of the work on Freire is very theoretical. So we were really trying to look at what was the on the ground, in the trenches work that Freire was doing, leading up to writing his first books. So I guess I really hold again this question of like, we learn from each other, right? Learning happens in a collective. Learning happens through dialogue. We're always learning from each other. And so much of what Freire was trying to do is dismantle this colonialist, Eurocentric, authoritarian kind of education that was very top down. It was also very, very limited. There was not a public school system in Brazil at the time. So really saying like education is for all, education is for everyone. Everyone has knowledge, wisdom, and it's so important to learn from each other and develop what he called critical consciousness of our lives, like what's unjust and what's wrong and how do we change it.
Thank you.
Thanks.
There's a question here from Brad Laird, a friend of yours, Alice, who says that he's grateful to you and Staughton for welcoming his daughter, his partner, and himself into your home about 10 years ago. And he says that he was learning to do some labor organizing with the industrial workers of the world. And he's wondering about the relationship between Quakerism, the IWW, and bottom-up polity, or the bottom-up politics that you and Staughton have lived out and written about. You kind of answered this maybe, or Marcus was maybe pointing to this question with regard to Quakerism, but I don't know if you have anything more to say to Brad about this.
Well, I think one of Staughton's favorite picket signs was "an injury to one is an injury to all," which is an IWW saying going way back. I think Staughton never joined the IWW, but he was always listening to them. And I think the IWW has a pretty checkered past, but they are really trying to, well, as I have had exposure to an IWW organizer recently, I hear him asking questions. I hear him not agreeing to some formal collective bargaining agreement, which may give up as much as it protects, but rather keeping the ability to respond to the particular situation as it arises. And I think that kind of unionism, where you stand up for each other. One incident that Staughton used to like to tell about is in an auto factory, you see people going out and you don't know what the issue is, but you figure, well, if they're stopping work, there must be something. I'll go out with them and then say, what's going on? That kind of they wouldn't be going out unless there was some problem that needed to be addressed. So we go out and then, well, how can we help, you know?
Yeah, thank you. Are there any questions in the auditorium here that are bubbling up for people? Feel free to raise your hand if you have a question you'd like to ask our panel or online. Okay, and we have one question here, and he's a fellow Quaker. I know this man, Greg Woods. Stella will bring you a microphone, Greg, in 1 second here.
Thank you. Oh, you can't really see me, so. So I have been interested in, how do we talk? And recently, I've been interested in, how do we talk about our shortcomings? And looking back at the shortcomings of the people we idolize, and something that is, we love to talk about our heroes' victories, but not their shortcomings. And especially like, so there are some, for example, there are some civil rights activists who, in later years, live lives totally devoid of what they were organizing for in the cities. So I think I have two questions. One for Alex is, how did you keep the faith as you went along, and maintain your ideals? And how should we talk about the shortcomings of those and of ourselves when we do great things and then we don't do great things? The most recent example is there is a lot of talk about Byron Weston, but after the March on Washington in 1963, by 1970, he is being vocal about military aid to Israel, like planes, like warplanes and military support. So a very radical departure from pacifism, but generally we leave that part out when talking about Byron Weston. I think we tend to give our hero one-dimensional feel and not a human feel. Do those two questions make sense?
I would say that your question about, we talk about our victories, but not our shortcomings. When I worked for a union, that was a rule. You never talked about anything, but we tried that and it didn't work. So we tried this and it worked better, something like that. The union is always right, and you were never to say anything adverse towards the union. However, this what I have experienced very much myself is somebody coming to you with a problem and you just don't have an answer for it. You know, you just feel like, I don't know what to do. I wish I could do something, but I don't see the way. And I mean, you recognize that the person needs help, they're coming to you for help, and you don't have any help to offer. It's a very, you know, it's a sad feeling when you feel like, well, what am I doing if I can't help? I think another thing is that sometimes one can help in very, very humble ways. And I'm finding that particularly now that I'm in an assisted living facility, that, you know, it takes maybe a minute or two to do something which can really make a difference in what that other resident, what's going on with them, just to put a word in so that they get the attention they need to a real problem. If I can't solve it, I might know somebody who could, and just put in a word.
Thanks, Alice, and thanks, Greg, for that question. Our next segment is on liberation theology.
Cuando en grupo de amados acercan la sonrisa de Dios ahí está.
Beginning in 1985, the Lynds used their summer vacations to make 5 trips to Nicaragua, 4 trips to Mexico, and numerous trips to the highlands of Guatemala.
One morning in the summer of 1986, we picketed along with other Americans outside the American Embassy in Managua against US support for the Contras, a counter-revolutionary military force.
At the end of the demonstration, a man came up to us and asked, "Are you Staughton and Alice Lynd?" It was a Jesuit priest, Joe Mulligan, who had attended discussions of drought resistance in our home when we lived in Chicago, and who later had served time in prison for burning drought files. He arranged for us to visit numerous Christian-based communities on our subsequent trips to Nicaragua.
On our last visit to Nicaragua in 1990, Joe arranged for us to visit 2 nuns who belonged to an extremely poverty-stricken village close to the Honduran border. We spoke very little English, so we sang to each other. We sang freedom songs from the United States Civil Rights Movement. They sang their movement songs, especially the most impressive of these songs began, "When the poor come to believe in the poor, then they can sing about their liberation."
The most influential '70s and '80s. Oscar Romero was apparently the first person to use the term.
There's very little doubt in my mind who is the commanding spiritual, religious prophet of these dreadful days. It's clearly Archbishop. Really listening to the prisoners, really listening to the discontented soldiers before you begin telling them what they ought to do.
The accompaniment to which Romero became committed more in the nature of a joint undertaking. It was a vision of the poor themselves taking responsibility for their own. The hope that we preach to the poor is intended to give them back their dignity, to encourage them to take charge of their own future.
Right here, he would say, the poor should seek justice in this world, not the next. The church does not want to liberate poor people so that they can have more, but rather that they are more. Liberation does not mean only redemption after death, so that people should just conform to the system while they are alive, he said. Liberation is redemption that is already beginning on this earth. Liberation means that the exploitation of one human being by another being homeless, not having a place to live. A Christian community cannot present itself as a place of peaceful refuge from the world. Rather, it must be a yeast, a salt, or a light.
In a situation arson and so on, he said, consciences can lose all sensitivity, and we have to go on repeating no to violence, yes to peace.
Romero was an outspoken voice against the death people.
The letter reportedly said, they sent us to kill people in the countryside, people whose names we didn't know, let alone what they've done. More likely they were Christians like us, that's all. And we had to go spray them with bullets, burn their little shiners. Weren't cruel just to the campesinos, they were also cruel to us. They beat us too. Doesn't matter if you're dressed up like a
of our own people. You kill your own campesino brothers and sisters. No soldier is obliged to obey an order against the law of God. It's time to recover your consciences. In the name of God and in the name of this suffering people whose laments rise to heaven each day more tumultuously, I beg you, I ask you, I order you in the name of God, stop the repression.
El Salvador's Archbishop, Oscar Romero, was gunned down while saying Mass the next day.
For those of you who don't know about liberation theology, I'll just say maybe a couple words, in particular with regard to Latin America, where it's often associated with Latin American forms of theology. In many ways, I think liberation theology within the context of Latin America can be understood as an aspect of decolonization, which is to say, if we think about the history of colonialism in Latin America, what we have is kind of a combination of European secular power, but linked with that historically has been ecclesial power or church power. Eduardo Galeano, the historian of Latin America, spoke of, that with colonialism came scripture, a reclaiming of faith toward a different kind of future that resists colonialism and opens up a space for a faith that is oriented toward freedom and justice. It's a faith, I think, that comes from below in that regard, from ordinary people. And liberation theology is the reflection on the action of decolonization within that context of ordinary people's faith. That's how I kind of come to understand it within the context of Latin America. Marcus, I don't know if you want to add more to that or say anything else in response to what I said.
Well, Rye, I think expressed a movement of the poor from below against a kind of Christianity from above that was always allied with state power and the power of the upper class. Which always stress different themes, freedom themes in the Bible. So this is actually part of something that is much broader than itself. There is a Black liberation theology, which I think is very important. But I guess one thing I would say to link this to other parts of our discussion is that liberation theology is a very good example of the way in which people like Staughton and Alice are drawn to movements where people are fighting to liberate themselves. And that what you do is you go to accompany, you don't go to organize, you go to listen, but most of all, you go to think with those people. Because their struggle from below is a powerful generative force that you can think with, in which new things seem possible based on these experiences of organization from below. So I think this is actually a very good idea of how Staughton and Alice were listening to radical currents around the world. Alice talked about having been inspired by conversations Vietnamese women had with soldiers. Here's another case of people of Staughton and Alice and many others in being inspired by these very local struggles for dignity and equality and democracy among the poorest of the poor. So it's a really important statement about where you can find inspiration. And I think you're exactly right, Rye, to say that liberation theology expresses this movement. In other words, it isn't the movement itself.
Right.
The movement generates this set of ideas, which then become part of a global debate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's interesting to me that Staughton was attracted to Romero in part, I think, because of this sort of ministerial task, as it were, of accompaniment, right? That Romero took this approach of listening to people and working alongside people in the struggle for justice. And I see commonalities there with SNCC organizers and the segment on SNCC and what you talked about, Zahara, but that work of listening to people. Bob Moses, that image of Bob Moses always standing in the back of the room, not imposing his will, but listening with the people. And of course, he learned that from Ella Baker, I think, at least as if his testimony is accurate. I don't know if Zahara, if you have anything to add to this conversation about listening and organizing or listening and accompaniment.
Yes, when I previewed the film and was this particular part on accompaniment and what Oscar Romero had been saying and teaching and all, I immediately thought, about the work that SNCC did in community. I mean, Mississippi, Alabama, those two that I'm most familiar with. I mean, as the story was told, when Bob Moses went into Mississippi, what he did was listen to the people. And the people told him that they were not interested in integrating the facilities because, that's what SNCC had been doing. SNCC comes out of that movement, but they wanted the vote and they wanted electoral power, political power. And so, of course, the Mississippi Freedom Summer Project was organized around that and came directly from what the people told Bob and the other SNCC people that they wanted. And I know that that's what I saw, working in Laurel, Mississippi for 18 months. We listened to what the people, they knew their situation better than we did. They knew what they wanted. And so what they wanted shaped the direction of the movement that we were building there with them. So this whole idea of it coming from the ground up is just, to me, the way you must organize if it's to be a genuine organizing that reflects what it is that people themselves want, know that they need, and the leadership emerges from the people. And what we did, as SNCC organizers, as we called ourselves and thought of ourselves, we really were catalytic agents. We were people who brought a few resources and connections to the outside world, if you will. But the impetus for the movement came from the people themselves. And I love that whole idea is when the poor recognize the poor, that's when liberation can begin. I just I saw that, I saw it, and I've seen it, over all these years of being out here attempting to work with people who want justice, who want freedom, who want equality, economic justice, you name it. So this is certainly my experience.
If I could just add, right, to go back to the IWW question and a favorite line that Staughton liked, the IWW, when they were approached by factory bosses or sometimes the police who would come to them and say, "Who are your leaders?" And they would say, "We are all leaders." They refused the hierarchy of the implicit in the question. We are all leaders. And so I think what this segment shows is that sometimes the people lead and the leaders follow.
Yeah.
And the leaders try to learn in the process of joining the struggle.
Yeah. Thank you for that. We have one more concluding segment, and then we're going to hear some closing reflections from Alice.
What is it that breaks down separation and division? I cannot believe that it's a formal religious creed, because the world is not of one creed. It's not going to be of one creed. And anyone who puts his or her whole life behind that hope is going to be disappointed. We're different, and yet the essential Macedonian proposition was that beneath the language of different creeds and outlooks on the world, there was something in common. There was an experience that all human beings share.
The place where men meet to seek the highest is holy ground.
Over many years, a Quaker phrase has increasingly taken on meaning for me. Let your light speak.
We just hold up our little candle and it is enough.
Guide my feet while I run this race.
Well, Alice, I've invited you to share a few concluding reflections. If you're still willing to do that, we'd love to hear them.
Well, I think that this panel tonight, we all are bringing our own experience to it, and we have interacted with each other. I don't know to what an extent all of you have interacted with each other, but I certainly have learned a lot and appreciated so much the work that each one of you has been doing. I don't really feel like I have anything to say that hasn't been said in one way or another. I have very much appreciated the contributions that every one of you has made in your own dedicated lives. Rye, is there something more that you feel needs to be said tonight?
I wonder if you have any words of encouragement. You don't necessarily see the people here, and maybe Rick can show you the auditorium. It's there are many students here, ranging from 18 to 23, and maybe we have some folks in their 60s and 70s even attending here tonight. And they're taking this class on active nonviolence. And they've been listening to you, and they've been hearing these stories from the panelists. And I wonder what kinds of words of encouragement you might have for them as they seek to let their life speak. What does that mean? What does that look like to you?
Well, something that meant a great deal to me was when Catherine regarded the finishing of the film not as finishing something, but as a springboard, as a beginning of something, where Staughton used to speak about the throwing of seed, and some seed you throw on barren ground and it isn't going to grow, but some seed you're going to throw in an area where it is going to take root and it is going to multiply. And I think that that's a vision that Catherine has projected, that if you can take this as a starting point, not a finished film so much as something that will suggest new directions. And I think that Marcus and Zohara and Catherine are trying to open up those possibilities. You don't know what your life can turn into if you follow your path. New things are going to open up. We can't tell you now what they're going to be. But if you're motivated, if you are seeking experience, you're going to find other people who want to also, and who can make suggestions and open up new possibilities that you hadn't thought of. often in the course of a conversation, you know, somebody will bring something up and it gives you a new idea. We learn from each other. If we are wanting to let that develop step by step.
We make the road by walking.
When I was young, I took creative dance, and the teacher would say, anybody can dance, make a movement. Now make another movement. Now make another movement. And how are people going to respond to those movements? If you think about it, what's the movement that I really want to say? What is it that I wish to encourage? Is it slow? Is it fast? Is it sudden? Is it, you know, what is it that you want to put into your dance? I'm sorry, the phone is ringing. Perhaps I'll go back on mute.
I love that image of dancing. That's a great way to end. Thank you so much to the panelists. Thank you to Rick for running the IT and to Stella for running around with the microphone, and to everyone who's spent their evening with us tonight. And let's give one more round of applause for our panelists.